So if you've been keeping your eyes on the news recently, there's been a lot of concern at schools in Gauteng in particular about the high rates of pupils, teenagers basically, who are attempting or have succeeded in completing suicide. Just a few weeks ago, the Gauteng Education MEC had to go out to speak to pupils at Tsakane Secondary School. That's on the East Rand, where some pupils had attempted to take their own lives. Let's talk more then about this issue, especially because yesterday was in fact World Suicide Prevention Day. We're joined tonight by the crisis line and Netcare Akeso marketing manager Megan Hosking. Megan, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for coming in. So I was struck by a piece that you have all published on this very issue, and the title simply reads, "The Unbearable Weight of Being." Let's unpack that, because a lot of people who deal with depression, who are suicidal, talk about a heaviness.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that to someone who's never been in that space or never considered or had suicidal thoughts seems completely illogical. But when you're in that space and you're feeling like just being is completely unbearable, that feels like your only choice. And that's part of the issue. Is just like any other terminal issue, any terminal illness, when you may be finding that you've been dealing with a lot of pain and a lot of suffering for an extended period of time and not feeling a release, it starts to feel like it's completely overwhelming and completely unmanageable. And unfortunately, that's what happens when someone gets to a suicidal point. Their weight on their brain and their heart and their mental illness is weighing on them in such an extreme sense that it feels like ending their life is the only solution available to them. And even though that's not the case, and we're here exactly for that, to talk about why it's not always the case and how it can be prevented, it feels like that for so many people, that it just feels too unbearable to carry on.
And you've alluded to something very important, that it isn't all brought down to one single issue. There are multiple reasons why a person may feel that way. I mean, I referenced depression earlier, but it's not only depressed people who choose to basically take their own lives.
There's an endless amount of things that contribute to feeling suicidal and any mental health issue in general. And that's everything from biological issues, emotional issues, social issues, environmental factors, your emotional well-being. And all of those things together create a situation that for some people triggers those thoughts and triggers those ideologies, which means that they're no longer thinking straight. They're no longer thinking that I shouldn't do this because I may leave people behind, or there is help available, but things just seem so bleak. And that's why it's such a difficult conversation for so many people to have, because things can look perfect to everyone else on the outside. But in reality, you're not seeing your life as perfect.
I mean, one of the things I find, especially in my family, when you speak to the older generation, so we say, whenever one of my peers has died in this way, is they go to, well, the person had a nice house, they had a nice car, a nice job, a family, maybe a new marriage, everything looked rosy, just what you're saying, what people see outside versus the internal turmoil.
Yeah.
It's important, isn't it, to note that you can look like you've got it all and still have battled the same thoughts as someone who, yes, is poor, is dealing with a lot, but that struggle is one that you have in common.
Absolutely. So no one's life is perfect, and often we think that other people's are, but we don't realize what everyone's dealing with internally and what struggles we're facing. And that's part of the thing is with mental health and with suicidality, is that it's almost a silent issue to a lot of people. It's something that to everyone else, my life looks perfect. But inside, I am dealing with so many thoughts and emotions that no one else can comprehend, that feels like no one else can understand. But it's just that. It doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But your life can be as perfect as it looks to anyone else outside, but you may still be experiencing this. Or
Why
you
is
could
it
be
still a silent issue, as you called it?
Stigma is a really big problem still. We don't have open conversations around this, and when we do, we're often unintentionally judgmental about these conversations with that exact thing. But your life is perfect, so why do you feel like this? And a little bit of blame around it. So we don't talk enough about mental health in general and the stigma, which is why we see such high issues in workplaces, among the men, perhaps with children, that we're just not having those conversations, and people are still judging other people for something that's actually not in their control.
And many of us have been quite alarmed to read about the scale of this problem at schools in Gauteng, but there's in fact research that suggests that it may be a bigger problem than many of us may have realized. I mean, for example, the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, that's SADC, has said that 17.6% of teenagers have considered attempting suicide. As many as 1 in 5 18-year-olds have had one or more suicide attempts. That's frightening.
Those are massive numbers. That's 2 kids in a class in a private school. I mean, that's really, really high numbers. And when people say that suicide doesn't impact them, it's just not true. It either impacts you directly or it impacts someone that you know. That's how high the numbers are. So in South Africa, we have a particularly high population issue with this. The most recent kind of worldwide research was done in 2019, which is even pre-COVID, so we could sort of imagine that that would be worse now. But we were seeing 23.5 people per 100,000 in South Africa dying by suicide, compared to a global average of 9 per 100,000. That's a big difference.
Why is that? Why is South Africa leading, and leading is not the right word, but why do we have such a higher rate compared to the world?
Well, we have a lot of other challenges that other countries may not have, and although we are a very resilient nation, we do still have a very big problem with stigma, like we said. We do perhaps, there's also things with reporting and understanding that, but we deal with different issues to, for example, other first world countries. And we see it in our neighbors as well, which shows that it's not unique. It's a Southern African problem that we're dealing with.
You and I were talking about stigma earlier, and I suppose that's more apparent among men and boys, because research says that, in fact, men and boys are at higher risk of completing suicide.
Yeah,
are
sadly.
we doing a good enough job at addressing that among them?
I think we're trying to. I think more and more people are making an effort to say, men, this applies to you as well. And those old adages like boys don't cry and, oh, you know, be a man, be strong, don't apply anymore. You can be strong while still being in touch with your mental health and recognizing that you may be struggling. Sadly, it is true that men do complete suicide more often, mostly because of the methods that they choose to use, which tend to be more aggressive. And at the end of the day, that leaves families often in a very difficult space, because we've now lost essential members of our society, essential members of our family, to something that we could have prevented.
And what's gone wrong for the children of South Africa? I suppose that'd be the question for many parents who have had a child come home with a letter saying a classmate has completed suicide, or a parent who tonight will have to drive to the local hospital to check in on a child of theirs who may have attempted to take their own life.
Yeah, I mean, to be a young person at the moment is certainly challenging. There's a lot of misconception that talking about this, especially with our young people, will encourage them to act on suicidal thoughts. It's not the case. We need to create safe spaces for them to have these conversations. But realistically, our young people are dealing with the same things we are as adults. They're just also dealing with school, and they're not yet always emotionally or mentally mature enough to make sense of stuff that is so out of your control. So while we may be frustrated with things that are happening around us, we have learned how to perhaps manage that, or that, well, we can't really do anything about it. But for a young person, that can feel so be-all and end-all of their life and their experience.
Megan, what do we do then for those who have survived a suicide attempt? Because they feel a lot of guilt, embarrassment often, because, I mean, I've seen accounts of people who say, well, I woke up in the hospital and I felt so ashamed because now everyone was there to judge me and question me based on what I had tried to do.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we want to avoid, is that judgment and that questioning. So while we do need to have a line of questioning in terms of understanding what might have led to this and what we can therefore do to help support that person to prevent it from happening again, we shouldn't be judgmental about that act. As a loved one, it can be very difficult to do that, because you are also dealing with your emotions and your feelings about what has transpired. But ultimately, we need to do our best to support our loved one through that space, to understand what might have led to this, and to then make sure that they get the help they need. So don't let them discharge from hospital without then having an appointment with a psychiatrist or a psychologist. If you're still worried about their safety, then keep an eye on them. Remove things from the house that may be harmful, and have those open and honest conversations, but mostly be kind.
We're out of time, but briefly I have to ask you this. The guilt and the complex emotion that people who've lost loved ones through suicide often feel. How do you process those feelings? People feel, did I miss a conversation? Did I miss a sign? Is it my fault?
It can be very easy to feel like that. And the first thing is, it's not anyone else's fault. It's no one's fault, not even the person who tried to harm themselves. We need to make sure that we are looking after ourselves as well as the people around us. So if you're struggling with dealing with emotions about something like that, then go get help yourself. Talk through it with someone. Try to understand what might have led to it. And most importantly, while you're being kind to the person that you love, be kind to yourself in that journey, and recognize it will take time for you to accept and deal with what has happened, whether it was completed or not, and then work through your stages of either healing or grief.
Megan Hosking, thank you so much for coming in to speak to us tonight.